Hello everyone. Tonight we begin the story of why medieval castles were so cold and miserable. A quiet journey into stone walls, endless winters, and lives lived in the shadow of duty. If you enjoy stories like this, please give the video a like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for that soft background hum, and let's travel together into another time. I am old now. My bones ache with the memory of winters that never truly left them. And when I close eyes, I see stone. Grey stone, black stone, stone slick with moisture that never dried. I see the high walls of Carlisle Castle, where I served for 32 years beneath 3 kings, and where I learnt that a fortress built to keep enemies out becomes a prison that keeps its own people trapped within cold that no fire can defeat. They call it a castle. They speak of it as though it were a place of glory, of feasting and tournament, of ladies in silk and knights in armour bright as mirrors. Perhaps in the great halls of Windsor or Westminster, such things existed for a fortnight in summer, when the king came with his court. But I knew Carlisle, I knew the North, and I tell you now, in the honesty that comes only when death stands close enough to make lies worthless, that a medieval castle was not a place of comfort or beauty. It was a place where men and women endured, where the cold seeped into your very soul, and where misery became so familiar that you ceased to recognize it as anything other than the natural order of existence. I came to Carlisle in the 28th year of King Edward I, in the year of our Lord 1300. I was 17 summers old, the third son of a minor knight who held land near Penrith, and my future had been decided as all third sons' futures were decided. I would serve. My father secured for me a position as assistant to the castle steward, a man named Hugh de Morville, who was 60 years of age and had spent his entire life within those walls. On the day I arrived, riding through the Barbican gate on a horse too old to be worth stealing, Hugh looked at me with eyes that held neither welcome nor contempt, only the weary recognition of one who had seen many young men arrive with hope and watched them grow hollow. The castle stood on a rise above the River Eden, its curtain walls of red sandstone quarried from the earth nearby. From a distance it appeared formidable, even beautiful in the way that instruments of war can be beautiful. 4 towers mark the corners of the inner ward, each rising 3 stories high with crenellated battlements that caught the light of dawn and turned briefly golden. The keep itself was square and massive, its walls 9 feet thick at the base, with arrow slits so narrow that a man's arm could barely pass through them. There was a great hall, a chapel, barracks for the garrison, stables, kitchens, storerooms built into the earth, a well that reached down into darkness, and all of it enclosed within walls that were meant to withstand siege engines and the fury of Scottish raiders who came south when harvests failed and desperation drove them to seek English grain. But from within, the castle revealed itself differently. It revealed itself as stone and more stone, as walls that wept with moisture, as floors that never dried, as chambers where the wind found passage through cracks invisible to the eye but unmistakable to any man trying to sleep. The very architecture that made it defensible made it uninhabitable. The walls that kept out arrows kept out warmth. The high windows that prevented scaling ladders prevented sunlight. The thick stone that resisted battering rams resisted also the heat of any fire, drinking it up and giving back nothing but dampness and chill. You would not believe how cold stone can be until you have lived surrounded by it. In summer, when the sun stood high and the fields beyond the walls turned gold with barley, the interior chambers remained cool and shadowy, which was almost pleasant. But for 8 months of each year, from September until May, the cold was a living thing, a presence that inhabited every room, every corridor, every stairwell. It rose from the floors, which were either bare stone or, in the better chambers, covered with rushes that grew damp and mouldy, and had to be changed every fortnight lest they rot entirely. It descended from the ceilings, which were stone vaults in the keep, and timber beams in the hall, both of which trapped cold air above and let it settle down upon the inhabitants like an invisible snow. The walls themselves sweated. I do not speak metaphorically. In winter, when the temperature within the castle hovered barely above freezing, and the air outside brought sleet and wind from the North Sea, moisture condensed upon the inner surfaces of the stone. You could see it glisten in torchlight, could watch droplets form and run down the walls in slow rivulets that pooled on the floors or soaked into the tapestries that hung there in a futile attempt at insulation. These tapestries, which in theory depicted scenes of holy writ or noble hunts, became heavy with water, developing dark patches of mould that smelled of earth and decay. We took them down twice each winter to dry them before fires, and each time they returned to the walls, they were a little more faded, a little more threadbare, a little more useless. I remember my first night in the castle. Hugh de Morville assigned me a sleeping place in a chamber on the second story of the keep, a room I shared with 2 clerks who kept the household accounts and a man-at-arms who had grown too old for regular duty, but who was kept on out of loyalty or pity. There were 4 straw mattresses on wooden frames, each with a woolen blanket that had been washed so many times it had become thin as cloth. The window was not glazed. Few windows were. Instead, it had wooden shutters that could be closed against the weather, but closing them meant sealing yourself in darkness, for we were allowed only 1 rushlight per chamber, and that only until the bell rang for compline. I lay down that first night still wearing my woolen hose and linen shirt, with my cloak pulled over me for additional warmth. The straw beneath me rustled and poked through the mattress cover. The air in the room was so cold that my breath emerged in visible clouds, and I could hear the wind outside finding its way through the shutters with a high, thin whistle that never ceased. Somewhere below, a door slammed. Somewhere above, footsteps crossed stone. The castle was never silent. It groaned and creaked like a ship at sea, and I lay there wondering how any man could sleep in such a place, how any man could live. But you grow accustomed. That is the terrible truth of human endurance. You grow accustomed to cold as you grow accustomed to hunger, to fear, to the smell of unwashed bodies and the taste of ale that has begun to sour. Within a month I no longer noticed the chill unless it worsened. Within 6 months I had learnt to sleep in my clothes, to wrap my feet in wool and straw before putting on my boots, to move quickly in the mornings before the cold could stiffen my joints entirely. I learnt which chambers were least draughty, which corridors caught the worst of the wind, where to stand in the great hall to receive the marginal benefit of the central hearth. The great hall was the heart of the castle, the place where the household gathered for meals and where the constable heard petitions and disputes. It was 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a high timber roof supported by oak beams that were already ancient when I arrived. At one end stood a dais where the constable and his senior officers ate at a raised table. At the other end were the screens passage and the doors leading to the kitchens, butteries and pantries. Down the centre of the hall ran 2 long trestle tables where the rest of us sat according to rank. Men-at-arms nearest the dais, then household servants, then labourers and grooms. In the centre of the hall, between the tables, was the hearth. It was circular, perhaps 8 feet across, built up slightly from the floor and lined with stone. The fire burned there from dawn until midnight, fed constantly by servants whose sole duty was to keep it alive. Wood smoke rose towards the roof, where it was supposed to escape through a louver, a small opening covered with slats to keep out rain. In practice, much of the smoke remained in the hall, hanging in the air at head height, making eyes water and throats burn. You learnt not to breathe deeply. You learnt to move through the smoke as through water, accepting it as part of the atmosphere. But even with the great fire burning all day and into the night, the hall was cold. The heat rose upward and escaped through the louver or through gaps in the roof that no amount of repair could permanently seal. It radiated outward a small distance from the hearth itself, perhaps 10 feet, creating a zone of relative warmth where men crowded when they could. Beyond that circle, the cold reasserted itself. At the tables, your face might be warm whilst your back froze. Your front might thaw whilst your feet remained numb. You ate your meals quickly, not only because the food cooled within minutes, but because lingering in the hall meant enduring the smoke and the press of bodies and the knowledge that your own chamber, when you returned to it, would be even colder. The food itself I shall speak of shortly, but first I must tell you of the other fires, the smaller fires in the private chambers, for these were perhaps the greatest source of misery in the entire castle. Only the constable's chamber, the ladies' chamber, and the solar A-room used for private meetings and finer work had their own fireplaces. These were built into the walls, with chimneys that rose through the stonework to emerge above the roofline. They were marvels of engineering, these chimneys, for they allowed smoke to escape without filling the room entirely. But they were also narrow and prone to blockage, and when the wind blew from certain directions it forced smoke back down into the chambers, making them uninhabitable until the wind shifted. Moreover, the fireplaces were small. They had to be, for the walls were thick and cutting a large opening would weaken the structure. A fire built in one of these wall fireplaces might warm a space of 6 or 7 feet directly in front of it, but the heat did not spread. The cold stone walls absorbed the warmth like a sponge absorbs water, giving nothing back. I've stood before a roaring fire in the constable's chamber, close enough that the front of my tunic grew hot to the touch, whilst the back of my neck remained cold and my breath still misted in the air. You would think that more fires would solve the problem, but fuel was a constant concern. The forests near Carlisle had been managed for generations, with strict laws governing what could be cut and when. Firewood was collected by labourers who worked under the direction of the castle forester, and it was stored in great woodsheds near the kitchens. But the amount of wood required to keep even a few fires burning throughout the winter was staggering. A single hearth in the great hall might consume the wood of an entire oak tree in a week. The constable's fireplace, if kept burning day and night, required 3 cartloads of wood per fortnight. Multiply this by the number of fires needed to provide even minimal warmth to the essential chambers, and you begin to understand the impossible arithmetic of heating a medieval castle. Thus, fires were rationed. The great hall fire burned always, for it was symbolic as well as practical, a sign that the household was alive and functioning. The constable's chamber had a fire most days, though even he sometimes allowed it to die down in the afternoons to conserve wood. The lady's chamber had a fire when she was in residence, which was not always, for she often travelled to other estates where life was less harsh. The solar had a fire on occasion, when important guests visited, or when documents needed to be read and written with fingers that could still hold a quill. For the rest of us, there was no fire at all. We slept in chambers that were scarcely warmer than the air outside. We worked in storerooms and offices where frost formed on the inside of the walls. We moved through corridors where our breath hung in clouds, and where the cold seemed to have weight and texture, pressing against exposed skin like a physical force. I learnt to dress in layers. Everyone did. In winter, I wore linen brays next to my skin, then woolen hose tied at the waist, then a long linen shirt, then a woolen tunic that reached to my knees, then a second tunic of heavier wool if I had one, then a cloak of felted wool that I fastened with a bronze pin. On my feet, I wore woolen stockings and leather boots lined with straw. On my hands, I wore mittens of wool when I could, though many tasks required bare fingers and left them red and stiff with cold. On my head, I wore a wool coif tied under my chin. Even so clothed, I was cold. The problem was that the garments, whilst they trapped some warmth, also absorbed moisture from the air and from my own body. Wool, when damp, loses much of its insulating property, and everything was always damp. Clothes dried slowly or not at all. You hung them near a fire if you had access to one, but in a chamber with 40 men competing for space near the hearth, you were fortunate to dry your cloak once a week. The rest of the time, you wore damp wool that smelled of smoke and sweat and mildew, and you accepted it because everyone else did the same. Bedding was no better. The straw in the mattresses became compressed and damp and had to be changed every few months, a task that required carrying great bundles up narrow stairs and disposing of the old straw, which was usually black with mould. The blankets were wool, sometimes 2 or 3 per person if you were fortunate, but they too grew damp and heavy. In the deepest part of winter, men slept in all their clothes beneath 2 blankets, and still woke shivering, their muscles stiff and their joints aching. I remember one January, in the 3rd year of King Edward II's reign, when the cold was so severe that the well in the inner ward froze. Not the water in the buckets, but the water in the well itself, 30 feet down where no sunlight reached. For 3 days, We had no fresh water except what could be melted from snow or drawn from the river, which meant sending men outside the walls with barrels, a dangerous task when Scottish raiders were known to be in the area. In the castle, the cold became something more than discomfort. It became a crisis. 2 of the older servants, both past 60, went to sleep one night and did not wake. Their vessels had simply ceased to breathe, as though the cold had finally convinced their bodies that there was no point in continuing. We buried them in the castle chapel's crypt, for the ground outside was frozen too hard to dig graves. Father Anselm, the castle chaplain, spoke the words over them, his voice echoing in the small stone chamber, where the air was so cold that the consecrated wine nearly froze in its chalice. I remember thinking that they had escaped, that wherever their souls had gone could not possibly be colder than where their bodies had dwelt. The chapel itself was a place of particular misery. It was small, built into the thickness of the keep's wall, with space for perhaps 40 people if they stood pressed together. There was one narrow window of coloured glass, a gift from some long-dead benefactor, which cast blue and red light onto the stone floor when the sun shone through it. There was a stone altar, a wooden crucifix, and a few benches for the elderly and infirm. The rest of us stood for the services, which were held each morning at prime and each evening at vespers, and which everyone was required to attend unless duty prevented it. In winter, the chapel was colder than almost anywhere else in the castle, because it was small and enclosed and never had a fire. The stone walls drew all warmth from the air, and the stone floor drew all warmth from your feet, even through leather boots. Services were kept short in winter, a mercy for which we were silently grateful, though we dared not say so aloud. Father Anselm himself, a man of perhaps 50 years who had come to Carlisle from a monastery in York, wore a heavy wool robe and fur-lined gloves with the fingers cut away so he could handle the sacred vessels. Even so, he often stumbled over the Latin words, his teeth chattering audibly in the silences between prayers. Faith, I suppose, should have warmed us. We were taught that the suffering of this world was temporary, that cold and hunger and pain were tests of our devotion, and that those who endured would be rewarded in the life to come. I believe this, as most men did, because not believing it would have made existence unbearable. But I confess that my faith was often a cold thing, as cold as the stone beneath my knees when I knelt to pray. I believed in God and in salvation, but I also believed that God had made the world harsh for reasons I could not fathom, and that if there was mercy, it was reserved for a life I could not see and could scarcely imagine. Superstition filled the gaps where faith faltered. We believed, for instance, that certain chambers were colder than others, not because of their position or construction, but because some tragedy had occurred there. The northwest tower was said to be haunted by a woman who had cast herself from the battlements during a siege 2 generations before my time. I never saw her, but I felt the cold in that tower, which was deeper and more penetrating than elsewhere, and I did not doubt that something lingered there. We avoided the tower when we could, and when duty required us to pass through it, we moved quickly and did not look into the shadows. We believed that illness was caused by bad air, by miasmas that rose from damp places or from the bodies of the sick. This was not entirely false, though we did not understand why. In a castle where hundreds of people lived in close quarters, where waste was disposed of in garderobes that drained into pits below, where the air was thick with smoke and the water often tainted, sickness spread easily. In winter, when we were all crowded together seeking warmth, a cough or fever could pass through the household like fire through dry grass. I saw many fall ill. The flux which caused a man to empty his bowels until there was nothing left but water and blood came nearly every winter, and took the weak and the young. Fevers came suddenly, turning strong men delirious and burning them from within until they either recovered or their path came to its close. Lung sickness came slowly, filling the chest with fluid and turning every breath into labour. We had remedies, of course, infusions of herbs, poultices of mustard or clay, bleeding to balance the humours. Sometimes these helped, often they did not. When a man fell seriously ill, we moved him to a corner of the barracks, or if he was important, to his own chamber, and we waited to see whether he would live, or whether we would need to carry that which had ceased to breathe down to the chapel. Hygiene, as you might imagine, was primitive. The castle had 2 garderobes, one in the keep and one in the great hall, which were small chambers built out from the wall with a wooden seat over a shaft that dropped down to a pit below. These pits were cleaned out once or twice a year by labourers who were paid extra for the task, and who, understandably, became drunk before they began. The smell of the guardrobes was such that you learnt to breathe shallowly when using them, and in summer, when the heat intensified the odour, they became almost unbearable. For washing, there was cold water from the well and rarely hot water carried up from the kitchens in buckets. Most men washed their hands and faces once a day, if that, and bathed their whole bodies perhaps once a month in winter, more often in summer. I do not say this to suggest we were filthy by choice, but rather that washing required effort and resources that were not always available. Hot water required fire and fuel. Privacy required space. Clean linen required laundering, which required more water, more fire, more labour. In a castle where every resource was stretched thin, cleanliness became a luxury reserved for the few. The constable, Sir Robert de Clifford, bathed perhaps once a week in a wooden tub that was carried into his chamber and filled with water heated in the kitchens. This was an elaborate process requiring servants to haul the tub up 2 flights of stairs, then to make multiple trips with buckets of hot water, then to wait outside while he bathed, then to carry the tub and the now dirty water back down again. Lesser members of the household did not have this privilege. We washed as best we could with cold water and cloths, and we accepted the smell of our own bodies and those of others as part of life. I mention this not to dwell on unpleasant details, but because the cold and the damp and the lack of cleanliness were all connected. They formed a web of discomfort that touched every aspect of existence. You could not stay clean when you were always cold, because washing with cold water in a cold room was a torment. You could not stay warm when everything was damp, because damp clothes and damp bedding drew heat from your body. You could not stay healthy when you were cold and dirty, because illness thrived in such conditions. And you could not escape any of it, because the walls held you prisoner as surely as iron chains. Now, I shall speak of food, which is always of interest, for men remember what they ate or failed to eat more clearly than they remember sermons or battles. The food at Carlisle was plain, monotonous, and often scarce, but by the standards of the time, it was sufficient. We did not starve, though there were months when we came close, and we did not feast unless the king or some great lord visited, which happened rarely. The basis of our diet was bread, ale, and pottage. Bread was baked in the castle ovens every day, great round loaves of coarse grain that weighed 3 or 4 pounds each. The quality depended on the grain available. In good years, the bread was made from wheat or rye and was tolerably soft. In bad years, it was made from barley or oats or a mixture of whatever could be had, and it was heavy and dark and hard enough to break teeth if you were not careful. We ate this bread at every meal, soaking it in pottage or ale to soften it. Ale was safer than water, which everyone knew, though no one understood why. The castle had its own brewhouse, where women worked to produce ale from barley, water, and herbs. The ale was weak, perhaps half the strength of what you might find in a tavern, and it was drunk by everyone from the constable to the lowliest groom. We drank it at breakfast, dinner, and supper, and we drank a great deal of it, for there was little else. The taste was sour and slightly sweet, and it varied depending on the quality of the barley and the skill of the brewers. Sometimes it was good, often it was merely tolerable. Occasionally it turned bad and had to be thrown out, which was a waste that made the steward curse. Pottage was a thick soup made from whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, turnips, peas, beans cooked with water, or sometimes meat broth and seasoned with salt and herbs. It simmered in great iron cauldrons in the kitchens from morning until night, and it was ladled out into wooden bowls at mealtimes. You ate it with a spoon, or more often, soaked your bread in it and ate the bread. It was filling if not satisfying, and it had the advantage of being hot, which in winter was almost as important as being nourishing. Meat was a luxury. We ate it perhaps 3 or 4 times a week, and then it was usually salted pork or salted beef from animals slaughtered in the autumn and preserved for the winter. The salt was necessary to prevent the meat from spoiling, but it also made the meat hard and dry, and so salty that you had to soak it in water before cooking it. Even then it was tough and required long boiling to become chewable. Fresh meat was rare, available only when an animal was slaughtered for immediate consumption or when hunters brought back game from the forests: a deer, a boar, rabbits, birds. This happened occasionally, and when it did, the mood in the castle lifted perceptibly, for fresh meat was a reminder that life could offer pleasure. Fish we ate on Fridays and during Lent, for the church commanded it. The River Eden provided pike, trout and salmon, and the sea, which was not far distant, provided salted herring and dried cod. Fish was better than no meat, but it was still monotonous, and by the end of Lent, when we had eaten fish twice a day for 40 days, the sight of it turned the stomach. Cheese, butter and eggs were available in varying quantities, depending on the season. In spring and summer, when the cows and goats and chickens were productive, we had more. In winter, when animals gave less, we had less. Cheese was hard and kept well, and we ate it with bread. Butter was precious and used sparingly. Eggs were boiled or fried in fat when fat was available. Vegetables and fruits were seasonal. In summer and autumn, we had fresh peas, beans, cabbages, apples and berries. These were eaten immediately, or preserved by drying or pickling. In winter, we had what had been stored: dried peas and beans, salted cabbage, apples that had been kept in the storerooms and were often half rotten. Fresh food was a memory, and by March, when the stores were running low and the new harvest was still months away, the meals became sparse and the quality poor. The quality of your food depended on your rank. At the high table on the dais, Sir Robert and his officers ate better than the rest of us. They had more meat, fresher bread, wine instead of ale, and sometimes dishes flavoured with expensive spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, that came from distant lands and cost more than a labourer earned in a year. The rest of us ate at the lower tables and received simpler fare, but even Sir Robert did not eat well by the standards of a London merchant or a southern lord. He ate what the castle could provide, and what the castle could provide was limited by geography, season, and the endless need to keep stores in reserve against siege or famine. Meals were communal and brief. The household assembled in the great hall twice a day, at midday for dinner, and in the early evening for supper. We stood behind the benches until the constable arrived, then sat at a signal. Grace was said by Father Anselm quickly and by rote, and then food was brought from the kitchens and served by pages and young servants who moved up and down the tables with bowls and jugs. You ate what was given to you. There was no choice. If you wanted more, you might be granted it if supplies were sufficient, and if you had performed some service that merited favour. If not, you went hungry. Meals were eaten in relative silence, not because silence was required, but because men were hungry and wished to eat, and because conversation required energy that was better saved. The hall was filled with the sounds of eating, spoons scraping bowls, teeth tearing bread, the slurp of ale being drunk. Occasionally someone spoke, asking for bread to be passed or commenting on the quality of the pottage. But there were no long conversations, no laughter, no songs. Those came later, if at all, when the meal was finished and men lingered near the fire before returning to their duties or their beds. I think often of how hunger shaped us. Not the sharp hunger of starvation, which I experienced only once, during a particularly harsh winter when supplies ran low, but the constant low hunger that was always present, the feeling that you had eaten but were not satisfied, that your body wanted more but there was no more to be had. This hunger made men irritable and slow. It made them guard their food jealously, eyeing their neighbour's portion to ensure it was not larger than their own. It made them grateful for small mercies, an extra piece of meat, a fresher loaf of bread, a cup of wine on a feast day. And yet paradoxically, hunger also created a kind of equality. Rich and poor, noble and servant, we all felt it to some degree. Sir Robert ate better than I did, but he too knew the gnawing emptiness of a long winter when the stores were low. He too ate salted meat and hard bread and pottage that had been cooked from the same vegetables for a month. The cold and the damp and the hunger were great levellers, stripping away pretense and revealing what all men were beneath their titles, creatures who needed warmth and food and shelter, and who suffered when they did not have them. Let me now speak of the rhythms of daily life, for it is in the small repetitions of each day that the true character of a place reveals itself. Life in Carlisle Castle was governed by routine, by tasks that repeated themselves with the regularity of the seasons and the hours. As assistant to the steward, and later, after Hugh de Morville's path came to its close, as steward myself, I was responsible for ensuring that this routine was maintained, that the castle functioned as a household, and not merely as a military garrison. The day began before dawn. In winter, this meant waking in darkness so complete that you could not see your hand before your face. You rose from your damp straw mattress, felt for your boots in the dark, pulled on your cloak, and made your way through corridors lit only by memory and the occasional rushlight that burned in a wall sconce. You joined the others in the chapel for prime, standing in the cold and reciting prayers you had long since memorized. Then, as the sky began to lighten, you went to your work. For me, this meant descending to the storerooms to take inventory of supplies. Flour, oats, barley, salted meat, salted fish, dried peas, dried beans, cheese, candles, rushes, firewood, ale. All of it had to be counted and recorded so that we knew what we had and how long it would last. This was tedious work, requiring attention and basic arithmetic, but it was important. A castle under siege could survive if it had sufficient stores. Without them, it would fall within weeks. After the morning inventory, there were orders to give, instructions to the cooks about what to prepare for dinner, instructions to the servants about cleaning the hall, instructions to the labourers about repairs that needed to be made, a door that no longer closed properly, a section of roof where rain was getting in, a floor that had become dangerously uneven. There were always repairs. Stone did not decay as wood did, but it cracked and shifted, and the mortar between the stones crumbled and had to be replaced. The castle was never finished, never perfect. It was always in the process of falling apart, and we were always in the process of holding it together. In the afternoons, I attended on Sir Robert. He held court in the solar, a small room above the great hall where a fire usually burned and where the light from 2 narrow windows made it possible to read and write. Here he received reports from his officers, the captain of the guard, the master of horse, the master of works, the huntsman, the forester. Here he settled disputes among the tenants who farmed the lands around the castle, adjudicating arguments over boundaries and debts and inheritances. Here he read letters from the king or from other lords, letters that arrived irregularly and often contained news that was weeks or months old. I stood near the door during these sessions, ready to fetch documents or to summon someone if needed. I listened to everything and learnt the patterns of power, the ways in which decisions were made and commands given. I learnt that power was not always loud or dramatic. Often it was quiet, a matter of one man suggesting something to another in a tone that made refusal impossible, or of withholding approval until certain conditions were met. I learnt that loyalty was valued above competence, and that a man who could be trusted was worth more than a man who was clever but unreliable. In the evenings after supper, there was sometimes entertainment. A travelling minstrel might arrive and sing for his supper, accompanying himself on a small harp or lute. His songs were usually tales of war and courtly love, of King Arthur and his knights, of Roland and Oliver, of damsels rescued and dragons overcome. We listened because there was little else to do, but I always found the songs strange, for they described a world that bore no resemblance to the one I inhabited. The knights in the songs fought in tournaments and won the favour of beautiful ladies. The knights I knew were hard men who smelled of sweat and horses, and who spent their days training for wars that were brutal and inglorious. The castles in the songs were places of splendour and romance. The castle I knew was cold and damp and smelled of smoke and waste. Occasionally there were dice games or games of tables, though gambling was officially forbidden. Men played in corners of the hall or in the barracks, wagering small amounts, a cup of ale, a piece of bread, a coin if they had one. I did not gamble often, for I had little to wager and less inclination, but I understood the appeal. It was a way to pass time, to feel briefly that fortune might favour you, that something in your life was not entirely determined by birth and duty. More often, evenings were spent simply sitting near the fire, staring into the flames and thinking your own thoughts. Men repaired their clothes or their equipment, stitching a torn tunic or oiling a leather belt. They talked quietly with the men next to them, sharing small confidences or simply exchanging words to break the silence. They prayed, fingering wooden rosary beads and murmuring the Pater Noster over and over. And then, when the fire began to die down and the cold reasserted itself, they went to their beds and slept the sleep of exhausted men. Sundays and holy days broke the routine slightly. On these days we attended Mass, which was longer and more elaborate than the daily offices. The altar was dressed with the best cloth, the chalice polished until it shone, and Father Anselm wore embroidered vestments that had been gifts from some forgotten benefactor. The Mass was sung rather than spoken, and though few of us could follow the Latin, the music had a beauty that offered a moment's relief from the harshness of daily life. After Mass, there might be a slightly better meal, with more meat or a sweet dish made from dried fruit and honey. Work that was not essential was suspended, and men were given time to mend their own clothes, to write letters if they were literate, or simply to rest. But even on Sundays, the castle did not stop. Guards still manned the walls. Cooks still prepared food. Grooms still tended horses. The machinery of the household continued, for it could not afford to stop. Feast days were rare and precious. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the Feast of St. John, the Feast of St. Michael. On these days, the hall was decorated with evergreen branches, the tables laden with more food than usual, and the mood lighter than on ordinary days. Sir Robert might distribute small gifts to the household, a coin to each man-at-arms, a piece of cloth to the servants, a cup of wine to those who had served well. These gestures were appreciated not for their material value, which was small, but for what they represented. Recognition, acknowledgement that we existed as individuals and not merely as functions. Yet even on feast days, the cold remained. The evergreen branches did not warm the hall, the extra food did not heat the stone, the gifts did not make the wind stop howling through the arrow slits. We ate and drank and tried to be merry, but the merriment was forced, a performance we gave for ourselves and for each other, a pretense that life was bearable. And when the feast ended, and we returned to our cold chambers, the pretense ended too, and we were left once again with the reality of stone and damp and winter that seemed as though it would never end. I must speak now of the winters themselves, for they were the defining experience of castle life. Spring and summer and autumn were merely interludes, brief respites before the cold returned. Winter in the north of England was not like winter in the south, where men spoke of frost and chill, but where the sun still shone with some regularity, and where snow was a curiosity rather than a constant. Winter in the north was darkness and cold and wind that came from the sea and drove sleet against the walls until the stones themselves seemed to weep. It began in October, when the days shortened rapidly, and the morning frosts no longer melted by midday. The trees lost their leaves, and the hills beyond the castle turned brown and grey. The livestock that had grazed in the fields all summer were brought in, the pigs slaughtered, the cattle and sheep moved to barns where they would spend the next 6 months eating stored hay and growing thin. The castle prepared itself like a creature settling in for hibernation. Stores were checked and rechecked, repairs were made to roofs and shutters, extra firewood was brought in and stacked in every available space, and then the cold came. It came gradually at first, a chill in the air that made you pull your cloak tighter. Then it deepened, settling into the stones and the earth, turning the ground hard as iron and the water in the barrels to ice each night. By December, the cold was everywhere and everything. It was in the air you breathed, which hurt your lungs if you inhaled deeply. It was in the metal of the door hinges, which burned your fingers if you touched them with bare skin. It was in the floors, which were so cold that standing on them in your bare feet, even for a moment, was painful. Snow came, sometimes in flurries that lasted an hour and left a dusting of white, sometimes in storms that continued for days and buried the castle in drifts that reached halfway up the curtain walls. When the snow came, the world outside disappeared. The walls, the river, the hills, all of it vanished into whiteness, and the castle became an island floating in a sea of snow. Travel became impossible. No messengers arrived. No merchants came with goods. We were alone, sealed in by the weather, dependent entirely on what we had stored. The silence of snow was eerie. It muffled sound, absorbing the usual noises of the castle so that even the great hall seemed quiet. Footsteps did not echo. Voices did not carry. The wind, when it blew, made a sound like a distant voice, rising and falling, almost like someone crying far away. At night, lying in the darkness with snow falling outside, you could almost believe that the world had ended, that nothing existed beyond the walls, that you and the others in the castle were the last people alive. The cold did strange things to men. Some became withdrawn, speaking less and less until they barely spoke at all, moving through their days like shadows. Others became irritable, snapping at small provocations, arguing over nothing. Fights broke out occasionally, usually in the barracks where men lived in closest quarters, and they had to be stopped before they became serious. One winter, 2 men-at-arms came to blows over a blanket that each claimed was his own. One drew a knife, and before anyone could intervene, the other received a mark left by steel across his ribs. He survived, but the man who had struck him was flogged in the courtyard as punishment, his back laid open by the whip whilst we all watched. This was justice, swift and harsh, meant to remind us that order had to be maintained even in the depths of winter, when the cold made us all half mad. I think the worst part of winter was not the cold itself, but the endlessness of it. Week after week, month after month, the cold continued. January was colder than December. February was colder than January. March brought no relief, only the bitter knowledge that winter had lasted so long already and showed no sign of ending. You woke each morning hoping that today would be warmer, that the sun would shine, that the ice in the water barrels would melt. And each morning you were disappointed. By late winter, supplies ran low. The bread was baked from the last of the grain, mixed with whatever could be found to stretch it: ground peas, acorns, even sawdust in the worst years. The ale grew thin and sour, the salted meat was gone, and we ate dried fish and beans and pottage made from vegetables that had been stored too long and were half rotten. Hunger returned, sharper now because we knew that the new harvest was still months away, and there was nothing to be done except endure. People grew ill. The flux spread through the household, leaving men weak and hollow-eyed. Lung sickness took the old and the very young. Fevers came and went. Each week, it seemed, someone's path came to its close, and we carried their vessel down to the crypt and said the prayers and wondered who would be next. Father Anselm worked tirelessly, administering the last rites, hearing confessions, offering what comfort he could. But even he grew gaunt and tired, his voice hoarse from the cold and damp of the chapel. I remember one particular winter, in the 18th year of King Edward II's reign, when the cold lasted until May. Snow fell on the first day of April, which was taken as a terrible omen. The stores were almost exhausted. We were eating bread that was more sawdust than grain, and the ale was so thin it was scarcely darker than water. Men began to speak openly of starvation, of the possibility that we might not survive until the harvest. Sir Robert ordered rationing, reducing each man's portion by half, and even then we knew it might not be enough. It was during this time that I saw what hunger does to loyalty. Men who had served faithfully for years began to steal food from the stores. Not much, a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, but any theft was a betrayal. When the thefts were discovered, Sir Robert had no choice but to punish the offenders harshly, for if he did not, the stealing would spread, and the stores would be emptied within days. 2 men were flogged. A third, who had stolen a larger amount and had been caught before, was taken to a chamber in the northwest tower and left there for 3 days with no food or water. When they brought him out, he could barely walk, and his eyes had a hollow look that never entirely left them. I understood why they had stolen, and I pitied them, but I also understood Sir Robert's position. He was responsible for the entire household, and he could not allow individual desperation to destroy the collective. It was a cruel arithmetic, the kind that those who have never faced starvation cannot comprehend. You measure the value of one man's life against the lives of many, and you make the choice that ensures the most survive, even if it means allowing some to suffer more than others. Spring came eventually, as it always did, though by the time it arrived we were so exhausted that we could barely feel relief. The snow melted, revealing a courtyard littered with debris and filth that had been hidden beneath the white. The river thawed, and the sound of running water was strange and almost frightening after months of silence. Birds returned, and their songs seemed too loud, too cheerful, almost mocking. The air warmed, slowly at first and then more quickly, and we began to shed the layers of clothing we had worn for so long that we had forgotten what it felt like to move without their weight. The fields were ploughed and planted. The livestock that had survived the winter were turned out to graze. Fishermen went to the river and returned with fresh pike and trout. merchants arrived with good salt, spices, cloth, iron and news from the wider world. The king had done this, the Scots had done that, a great lord had passed, a new war was beginning. We listened to the news with interest, but also with detachment, for the wider world had little relevance to our lives. What mattered was that winter was over, and we had survived. But survival came at a cost. Each winter left its mark, wearing us down a little more, making us a little older, a little weaker, a little more aware of our mortality. I saw men in their 40s who looked 60, their backs bent, their hands gnarled with pain, their faces lined and grey. I saw women who had been young and strong become old before their time, their teeth falling out, their hair turning white, their bodies failing from years of cold and damp and hard labour. And I saw myself in the reflecting surface of a basin of water, and I barely recognised the face that looked back at me, thin, weathered, older than my years. The castle itself aged as well. Each winter, a little more mortar crumbled. Each spring, a few more stones needed to be replaced. The roof of the great hall developed leaks that could not be entirely repaired, and we placed buckets beneath them to catch the rain. The walls developed cracks, narrow at first but widening over time, and although the masons filled them, they always returned. The castle was stone, and stone was supposed to be eternal, but we learnt that nothing is eternal, that even stone grows tired and begins to fail. Let me speak now of the people who inhabited this place, for a castle is not merely stone and timber, but also the lives lived within it. I have mentioned Sir Robert de Clifford, the constable, but I should tell you more of him, for he was the centre around which the household revolved. He was a man of perhaps 45 years when I first came to Carlisle, tall and broad-shouldered, with a warrior's bearing, and a face that had been handsome once but was now marked by scars and hard living. He had fought in Scotland and Wales, had been captured once and ransomed, and had served 3 kings with a loyalty that was never questioned. He was not a warm man. He did not invite affection or seek companionship. He was distant, formal, concerned always with duty and honour, and the proper ordering of things, but he was also fair, which is perhaps the most one can ask of a lord. He did not punish capriciously. He did not favour one man over another without cause. He listened to complaints and petitions and made decisions based on what he believed was right, even when those decisions were unpopular. Men respected him, which is not the same as loving him, but is perhaps more valuable. His wife, Lady Margaret, was of a different temperament. She was younger than he by some 15 years, the daughter of a northern baron, and she had married Sir Robert as part of some alliance I never fully understood. She spent much of her time away from Carlisle, visiting her family's estates or staying in York where life was less harsh. When she was in residence, she brought a kind of energy to the castle, ordering the servants about with a sharpness that was almost cruel but which also made things happen. Under her direction the hall was cleaned more thoroughly, the meals were better prepared, the household ran more smoothly. But she did not love Carlisle. You could see it in her face, in the way she looked at the walls as though they were a prison, in the way she counted the days until she could leave again. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, but the children were not raised at Carlisle. They were fostered out, as was the custom among the nobility, sent to other households to learn courtly manners and the skills they would need for the lives awaiting them. I saw them only a few times, briefly, when they visited with their mother. They seemed like creatures from another world, dressed in fine clothes, speaking French as easily as English, moving with a grace that was foreign to the rough, practical world of the castle. I wondered if they even knew what their father's life was truly like, if they had any understanding of the cold and the hardship he endured to maintain the power and position that would one day be theirs. Among the household, there were many I came to know well over the years. There was Walter, the captain of the guard, a man of 50 who had lost 3 fingers on his left hand in some forgotten skirmish, and who trained the younger men-at-arms with a harshness that was necessary, because any weakness might mean their path coming to its close in battle. There was Alice, the head cook, a large woman with arms like a blacksmith's, and a voice that could be heard throughout the castle when she was angry, which was often. She ruled the kitchens as Sir Robert ruled the castle, and woe to any servant who crossed her. There was Thomas, a clerk who kept the household accounts, and who had been at Carlisle longer than anyone could remember. He was a small, bent man with weak eyes who sat in the solar, day after day, scratching figures onto parchment with a quill that he sharpened so often the nib was worn to almost nothing. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was surprisingly strong, and his opinions were valued because he knew everything about the castle's finances, every debt, every obligation, every resource. And there was Hugh de Morville, my predecessor, who taught me everything I know about managing a household. Hugh was a patient man, which was fortunate, for I was not an apt pupil at first. I made mistakes, forgot things, confused one task with another. But Hugh never shouted or struck me, as many masters would have done. Instead, he corrected me quietly, showing me again how things should be done, explaining why each task mattered. He told me that a good steward was invisible, that his work should be so well done that no one noticed it, that the household should function smoothly without anyone having to think about how or why. Hugh's path came to its close in the winter of my 6th year at Carlisle. He had been unwell for some time, coughing blood into a cloth that he tried to hide, growing thinner and weaker until he could barely climb the stairs to the solar. Father Anselm heard his confession and gave him the last rites, and Hugh lay in his chamber for 3 days, breathing in shallow gasps until finally he breathed no more. We buried him in the chapel crypt, and Sir Robert appointed me steward in his place. I was 23 years old, and I felt the weight of the responsibility like a physical burden. Over the years I watched many others follow Hugh into the crypt. Some went suddenly, victims of accident or violence. A man-at-arms fell from the battlements during a storm and was found in the morning, his vessel broken on the cobblestones below. A servant was kicked by a horse and died 3 days later, never having regained consciousness. A boy who worked in the kitchens cut himself on a knife and the wound went bad, swelling and oozing and finally taking him despite all Alice's poultices and prayers. Others went slowly, worn down by age and cold and the accumulation of small injuries that never quite healed. You could see it coming months in advance, could watch as a man grew slower and weaker, as his hair whitened and his skin took on a yellowish cast, as he began to sit more often and move less, as the light in his eyes dimmed. And then one morning he would not wake, or he would collapse in the hall, or he would take to his bed and not rise again. We would carry him to the chapel, say the prayers, and lay him in the crypt among the others who had gone before. The crypt was a cold place, even in summer, a stone chamber beneath the chapel floor reached by a narrow stairway. Bodies were wrapped in linen and laid on stone shelves that lined the walls. There was no room for wooden coffins, no space for monuments or elaborate tombs. The dead lay in rows, silent and still, until their linen rotted away and their bones were moved to make room for new arrivals. It was a practical arrangement, suited to a place where space was limited and death was common. I went to the crypt often, more often perhaps than was strictly necessary, for in addition to my duties as steward, I sometimes assisted Father Anselm with preparing the vessels for burial. I helped wash them and wrap them and carry them down the stairs. I stood beside Father Anselm as he commended their souls to God, and I listened to the echo of his voice in that small stone chamber and thought about how many had lain there before and how many would come after. The dead did not frighten me. They were simply people who had ceased to be, who had shed the burdens of cold and hunger and pain and moved on to whatever came next. I envied them sometimes. In the depths of winter, when the cold was so severe that I could not imagine ever being warm again, I envied them their stillness, their freedom from the endless struggle to survive. But I did not seek to join them. I was not melancholy by nature, merely weary, and I continued to do my work because work was what I knew, and because idleness would have been unbearable. I have spoken much of hardship and little of joy, and you might think that life in the castle was entirely without pleasure. That would not be accurate. There were moments of satisfaction, even happiness, though they were small and fleeting. There was satisfaction in completing a task well, in seeing the stores properly organised, in knowing that the household would eat today because you had done your work. There was pleasure in a good meal on a feast day, in the taste of fresh meat after weeks of salted provisions, in a cup of wine that warmed your belly and loosened your tongue. There was companionship of a sort. Men who lived and worked together for years developed bonds, not of friendship exactly, for friendship implies a kind of equality and intimacy, that was difficult to achieve in a place so governed by hierarchy, but of mutual understanding and respect. You knew the men around you, knew their strengths and weaknesses, knew who could be relied upon and who could not. You shared hardships, and that sharing created a connection that did not require words. There were also moments of beauty, rare but real. A winter sunrise seen from the battlements, when the sky turned gold and pink, and the snow-covered hills glowed as though lit from within. The sound of voices raised in hymn during Christmas Mass, blending together in a harmony that transcended the cold stone of the chapel. The sight of spring flowers pushing up through the earth in the inner ward, tiny and fragile but undeniably alive, proof that the world continued despite everything. But these moments were brief, and they did not change the fundamental nature of castle life. The cold always returned. The hunger always returned. The work always continued. You might have an hour of pleasure or peace, but then it was time to check the stores again, to oversee the preparation of another meal, to listen to another complaint, to solve another problem. The castle demanded constant attention, constant labour, and it gave back very little except the knowledge that you had survived another day. As the years passed, I began to see patterns that I had not noticed when I was younger. I began to understand that the cold and the misery of castle life were not accidental, but were built into the very structure of feudal society. The castle was designed to be defensible, not comfortable. Its purpose was to project power, to control territory, to serve as a base for military operations. The people who lived in it were secondary to this purpose. We were the machinery that made the castle function, and like any machinery, we were maintained only to the extent necessary to keep us working. Sir Robert understood this, I think, though he never spoke of it directly. He knew that his position depended on maintaining the castle and the lands around it, that he held them only so long as he could defend them and provide soldiers to the king when called upon. He knew that the king did not care whether he or his household were comfortable, only whether they were effective, and so he managed the castle as efficiently as he could, conserving resources, maintaining discipline, doing what was necessary even when what was necessary was harsh. There were times when I questioned this system, when I wondered whether things had to be this way. Could not a castle be built with fireplaces in more chambers? Could not thicker walls be constructed with inner passageways to keep out draughts? Could not glass be fitted in the windows to let in light, whilst keeping out wind? The answer, I suppose, was yes. Such things were possible, but they cost money and labour that were needed elsewhere. Every coin spent on comfort was a coin not spent on defence. Every man employed to improve living conditions was a man not available to fight or farm. The priorities were clear, and comfort was not among them. I also came to understand that the cold served a purpose beyond mere defence. It reminded everyone of their place. Sir Robert had a fire in his chamber and wine with his meals, whilst the guards and servants shivered in unheated barracks and drank thin ale. This difference was not accidental. It reinforced the hierarchy, made visible the distance between lord and servant, between those who commanded and those who obeyed. The cold was a tool of control, a constant reminder that some lives mattered more than others, that some people were entitled to comfort, whilst others were expected simply to endure. And yet, paradoxically, the cold also revealed the fragility of that hierarchy. When winter came in its full fury, when supplies ran low and illness spread, Sir Robert suffered too. Not as much as we did, certainly, but he was not immune. He breathed the same cold air, ate from stores that were running out, worried about whether the household would survive until spring. In those moments, the distance between us narrowed, and you could see in his face the same fear and exhaustion that you felt yourself. Power, I learnt, does not protect you from winter. It merely makes the winter slightly less unbearable. There were also moments when the system broke down, when the careful order that Sir Robert tried to maintain collapsed under pressure. I mentioned earlier the thefts that occurred during the harsh winter of King Edward II's 18th year. But there were other incidents as well. Men deserted, slipping out of the castle at night and disappearing into the countryside, despite the risk of being caught and hanged. Fights erupted that could not be easily stopped. A servant girl was found to be with child, and no one would say who the father was, though there were rumours and suspicions that led to threats and accusations. In one particularly grim incident, 2 men were discovered plotting to remove Sir Robert and open the gates to Scottish raiders in exchange for a share of whatever was taken. The plot was poorly conceived and easily discovered, but it revealed how desperate some had become, how little loyalty meant when measured against hunger and cold. The 2 men were taken to the courtyard, and Sir Robert pronounced judgment upon them. They were to be cast aside quietly, their paths brought to a close without ceremony or mercy. I will not describe what followed except to say that it was done efficiently, and that which the rain soon washed away was gone by morning. The rest of us watched in silence, and the message was clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated, no matter how desperate the circumstances. These events troubled me, for they revealed the darkness that lived beneath the surface of ordered life. We were not, I realized, as civilized as we pretended to be. We were held together by fear and necessity, by the knowledge that alone we would perish, but together we might survive. And when that bond weakened, when fear and necessity were not enough, the savagery that lurked in all men came to the surface. I do not mean to suggest that we were monsters. We were simply people pushed to the edge of endurance, and at the edge, people do things they would not otherwise do. The castle made us harder, colder, more willing to accept cruelty as necessary. It taught us to value survival above kindness, order above mercy, obedience above justice. These were the lessons of stone walls and winter cold, and they were learnt by everyone who lived there, whether they wished to learn them or not. Let me tell you now of the final years, for they are the ones that remain clearest in my memory, perhaps because they are closest, perhaps because by then I had stopped being surprised by anything and simply observed with the clarity that comes from long experience. King Edward II's reign ended badly, as you may know. He was removed by his queen and her lover, removed quietly, and made to disappear in a manner that allowed for many interpretations but no certainty. His son, Edward III, took the throne, and we received word of this at Carlisle some weeks after it had occurred. Sir Robert called the household together in the great hall and announced that we now served a new king, and that our oaths of loyalty were transferred accordingly. It was a formality, for in truth the change meant little to us. Kings came and went, but the castle remained, and our lives continued much as they had before. Sir Robert himself grew old during these years. The vigour that had characterised him when I first arrived faded gradually, replaced by a heaviness that seemed to settle into his bones. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, spent more time in his chamber and less time in the hall or on the battlements. His hair, which had been dark with only a few threads of grey, turned entirely white. His face, already lined, deepened into crevasses that spoke of pain and weariness. Lady Margaret visited less frequently, and then stopped coming altogether. We heard that she had taken up residence in York permanently, that she preferred the comfort and society of a town to the isolation of a border castle. Sir Robert did not speak of her absence, but you could see the loneliness in him, the way he sat at the high table with empty places on either side, the way he sometimes stared into the fire with an expression that was almost bereft. His sons were grown by then, fighting in France where the new king had gone to press his claim to that crown. One of them was injured, we heard, though not seriously. The other distinguished himself in some battle whose name I have forgotten. Sir Robert received letters occasionally, brief reports written by clerks, and he read them in the solar with me standing nearby in case he needed something fetched. He never spoke of what the letters contained, but I could see in his face a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that his sons were serving honourably, sadness that they were far away and that he might not see them again. As for myself, I grew old as well, though I did not notice it as it happened. One day, I looked into a basin of water and saw an old man looking back, a man with grey hair and a lined face, and eyes that had seen too much. My hands, which had once been smooth and strong, were gnarled and stiff, especially in winter, when the cold made my joints ache. My back hurt most mornings, and I had to move carefully until my muscles loosened. I could no longer climb the stairs to the battlements without pausing to catch my breath, but I continued to work, for what else was there? I'd spent my entire adult life in service to the castle, and I knew nothing else. The routines that had once seemed burdensome had become comforting in their familiarity. I knew every storeroom, every passage, every chamber. I knew how much grain we had and how long it would last. I knew which servants were reliable and which needed watching. I knew when to press for more effort and when to allow laxness because men were too exhausted to give more. This knowledge was my value, the thing that justified my existence. In the 43rd year of my life and the 32nd of my service, Sir Robert de Clifford's path came to its close. He had been unwell for some time, suffering from a pain in his chest that came and went, but grew steadily worse. One afternoon, while sitting in the solar reviewing accounts with Thomas the clerk, he suddenly gasped and clutched at his chest. His face turned grey, and he slumped forward onto the table. Thomas called for help, and we carried Sir Robert to his chamber and laid him on his bed. Father Anselm was summoned and gave the last rites. Lady Margaret was sent for, though she was in York, and would not arrive in time. Sir Robert lingered for 2 days, sometimes conscious, sometimes not. When he was conscious, he spoke in fragments, giving instructions about the castle, about his sons, about affairs I did not fully understand. On the second night, his breathing grew laboured and then, towards dawn, ceased. Father Anselm closed his eyes and said the prayers for his vessel. We buried him in the chapel crypt, as we had buried so many others, though his place was marked with a stone carved with his name and the dates of his service. The household assembled for the funeral mass, and Father Anselm spoke of Sir Robert's loyalty and honour and devotion to duty. It was all true, and yet it seemed inadequate, for how do you sum up a man's life in a few words? How do you convey what it meant to live as he had lived, to carry the burden of responsibility for so many years, to endure the cold and the hardship and the loneliness and still maintain order and justice? After Sir Robert's passing, the castle was placed temporarily under the authority of his eldest son, who was still in France. A deputy was appointed to manage affairs until the son could return, a man I did not know well and who had no understanding of how things worked at Carlisle. There was confusion, delays in decision-making, a sense that the centre had collapsed and no one quite knew what would come next. I continued as steward, for the deputy needed me, but I felt adrift in a way I had not felt since I was young. Sir Robert had been a constant, a fixed point around which everything else revolved, and without him, the castle felt empty, purposeless. The walls were still there, the towers still stood, the gates still opened and closed, but it was as though the soul had gone out of the place. It was during this time that I began to think seriously about leaving. I was old enough now that I could retire with honour, could claim a small pension and find a place to live out my remaining years. I thought of returning to Penrith, to the lands my family had held, though I knew that my brothers were both gone now, one having passed years ago and the other having become a monk. I thought of finding a cottage somewhere, a place with a hearth and a garden, where I could spend my days in peace and warmth. But when I imagined this, I felt not anticipation, but emptiness. What would I do in such a place? I'd spent 32 years in service to the castle. It had defined me, shaped me, given meaning to my existence. Without it, I was nothing, a man with no purpose, no identity, no reason to wake in the morning. And so I stayed, continuing to perform my duties, managing the household, ensuring that the routines were maintained. The cold still came each winter. The stores still needed to be counted. The fires still needed to be lit and fed. The castle still demanded its due, and I gave it, because it was all I knew how to do. Would you have stayed if loyalty meant freezing in silence? Would you have endured year after year of cold and hunger and hardship, knowing that there was no reward except survival and the knowledge that you had done your duty? I ask not to judge, but because I genuinely do not know the answer. I stayed because I could not imagine leaving, but perhaps that is not the same as choosing to stay. Now, as I write this in what I know are my final years, I look back on my time at Carlisle Castle with mixed feelings. I do not regret my service. I did my work as well as I was able, and I believe I served honourably. But I also recognise that I paid a price for that service, a price measured not in coins but in warmth never felt, in comfort never known, in a life lived always at the edge of endurance. The castle still stands. It will stand for centuries after I am gone, its red sandstone walls weathered but enduring, its towers rising above the river, its gates ready to be closed against whatever enemies may come. But I wonder sometimes whether anyone will remember what it cost to maintain that fortress, whether anyone will think of the hundreds of men and women who lived and worked and suffered within those walls, who froze in winter and went hungry in lean times, and who gave their lives to keep the stones standing. Probably not. We were not great lords or famous knights. We were ordinary people doing ordinary work, and history does not remember such people. We will lie in the crypt or in unmarked graves in the churchyard, and our names will be forgotten. The castle will remain, but the lives lived within it will vanish as completely as smoke from a dead fire. This, then, is why medieval castles were so cold and miserable. They were cold because they were built to be fortresses, not homes, and because the technology and resources did not exist to make them comfortable. They were miserable because they concentrated large numbers of people in small spaces, because they isolated those people from the outside world, because they imposed rigid hierarchies that separated man from man, and because they demanded constant labour and sacrifice from everyone who lived within them. But more than this, they were cold and miserable because they reflected the world that created them, a world in which power was maintained through force, in which most people's lives were lived in service to others, in which comfort and security were rare and precious, and in which survival itself was an achievement worth celebrating. The cold of the castle was the cold of that world made stone and mortar, and those of us who lived there felt it in our bones and in our souls. I am old now, and I feel the cold more than ever. My chamber in the castle, for I am still here, still performing my duties, though I grow weaker each day, is the same chamber I was assigned when I first arrived more than 30 years ago. The walls still weep with moisture. The wind still whistles through the shutters. The stone floor is still cold enough to hurt bare feet. Nothing has changed, and nothing will change, because the castle is what it is and cannot be otherwise. Soon my path will come to its close. I will join Hugh de Morville and Sir Robert de Clifford and all the others in the crypt beneath the chapel. Father Anselm, if he still lives, will say the prayers over my vessel, and it will be laid on one of the stone shelves until the linen rots and the bones are moved, to make room for someone else. And the castle will continue, indifferent to my passing, as it was indifferent to my life. But before I go, I wanted to write this down, to leave some record of what life was truly like within these walls. Not the life described in songs and tales with its tournaments and feasts and noble deeds, but the real life of cold and damp and hunger and endurance. Someone should remember. Someone should know. The castle, I have come to believe, was never meant for human habitation in any true sense. It was meant to intimidate, to dominate, to control. It was meant to stand as a symbol of power, a physical manifestation of authority. Those of us who lived within it were incidental, necessary perhaps, but ultimately expendable. We kept the machinery running, we maintained the symbol, but we were not the purpose. We were the cost. And what a cost it was. I think of all the mornings I woke shivering, all the nights I lay in damp blankets waiting for sleep that would not come. I think of the meals eaten hastily in a smoky hall, of bread so hard it hurt to chew, of ale that tasted of mould. I think of the hours spent standing in cold corridors waiting for orders, of the endless checking of stores and accounts, of the arguments settled and problems solved only for new ones to arise immediately. I think of the people I knew, the faces that have stayed with me even as their names have begun to fade. Walter, the captain of the guard, who died of a fever in his 53rd year, still trying to give orders from his sickbed. Alice, the cook, who slipped on ice in the courtyard and struck her head, and was gone before anyone could reach her. Thomas the clerk, whose eyes finally failed him entirely, leaving him unable to read the accounts he had kept for 40 years, and who sat in the solar day after day with nothing to do until merciful death released him. I think of the young men who arrived as I once arrived, full of hope or at least acceptance, who expected to serve for a few years and then move on to something better. I watched them grow old in the castle's service, watched the hope drain from their faces, watched them become like the rest of us, hard, tired, resigned. Some few did leave, found positions elsewhere or inherited land that freed them from service, but most stayed because there was nowhere else to go, because this was what they knew, because the world outside offered no better prospects. The castle changed us all. It made us colder, not just in body but in spirit. We learnt not to feel too much, for feeling led to despair. We learnt not to hope for warmth or comfort, for hope unfulfilled was worse than no hope at all. We learnt to find satisfaction in small things, a fire that burned well, a meal that was not entirely unpleasant, a day when nothing went seriously wrong. These were our victories, and we celebrated them in silence, with a momentary easing of the constant tension that governed our lives. I have spoken of the physical cold, but I must speak also of the other cold, the one that existed between people. In the castle, every relationship was defined by hierarchy and duty. Sir Robert was the lord, and we were his servants. Among ourselves, there were gradations of rank and privilege that determined who ate first, who slept where, who spoke, and who remained silent. You might work alongside a man for 20 years and never truly know him, for intimacy required a kind of equality that did not exist within the castle's walls. Even families were separated. Married servants often lived apart, the husband in one barrack, the wife in another, meeting only when duties allowed. Children born to castle servants were sent away to be fostered or apprenticed, for there was no room for them, no way to care for them properly. Love, friendship, companionship, these existed, but they were constrained, limited, always secondary to the demands of service. I never married. I told myself it was because I was too busy, too devoted to my duties. But the truth was simpler. I could not imagine bringing another person into this life, could not imagine asking someone to share the cold and the hardship and the endless grind of castle existence. It seemed cruel, and I was not cruel by nature, only worn down by circumstance. There were women in the castle, servants and laundresses and the wives of men-at-arms, but they lived largely separate lives, sleeping in different quarters, eating at different times, moving through different spaces. I knew some by name and sight, exchanged words with them when necessary, but they remained distant, figures glimpsed across the hall or in corridors, their lives as hard as ours but in different ways. The loneliness of castle life is something I did not fully understand until I was deep within it. You were never alone in the physical sense. There were always people nearby, sounds of activity, the press of bodies in the hall or on the stairs. But you were alone in every way that mattered. Your thoughts were your own because no one asked what you were thinking. Your fears were your own because admitting fear was weakness. Your pain was your own because everyone had pain, and speaking of it accomplished nothing. This loneliness was part of the cold, part of the misery. It seeped into your bones along with the winter chill, and it never entirely left, even in summer when the sun shone and the air warmed. You carried it with you always, a weight that had no physical form but was as real as the stone beneath your feet. I wonder sometimes what we were defending. The castle existed to protect the king's interests in the north, to guard against Scottish incursions, to maintain English authority over a contested border. But for those of us who lived there, these abstractions meant little. We did not think in terms of kingdoms and crowns. We thought in terms of survival, of making it through another winter, of having enough food and fuel and staying alive until spring. The wars that raged beyond the walls, the political machinations of kings and lords, the great events that shaped the realm, these touched us only indirectly, through orders that came from distant places, through demands for men and supplies, through the occasional arrival of refugees fleeing violence. We heard news and we discussed it in the brief moments when discussion was possible, but it was like hearing about events in a foreign country, real but remote, significant but not relevant to our daily lives. What we were truly defending, I think, was the system itself, the feudal order that kept us in our places and that required the castle to exist. We maintained the walls so that power could be projected. We suffered the cold so that lords could hold their lands. We gave our lives, slowly or quickly, so that hierarchy could be preserved. Whether this was just or right or necessary, I cannot say. I know only that it was, and that we did what was required of us, because we had no choice. As I near the end of my life, I find myself thinking often of warmth. Not the inadequate warmth of castle fires, but real warmth, the kind that reaches into your bones and stays there. I imagine sitting in sunlight on a summer day, feeling heat soak into my skin without the knowledge that cold will return in a few hours. I imagine sleeping in a bed that is truly warm, with blankets that are dry and thick and sufficient. I imagine waking without pain, without stiffness, without the dread of another day of cold. These are fantasies, I know. The cold is part of me now, has been for so long that I'm not sure I could exist without it. My body has adapted, learning to function with minimal warmth, learning to keep moving because stillness means freezing. If I were placed in a truly warm room, I think it would feel strange, almost uncomfortable, the way bright light hurts eyes that have grown accustomed to darkness. But still, I imagine it. I imagine a life that might have been different, a life lived in a place where walls did not weep, and where breath did not mist, and where a fire actually warmed the air, instead of merely creating a small circle of heat surrounded by vast cold. I imagine this, not because I believe it could have been mine, but because imagining it is one of the few pleasures left to me. Father Anselm tells me I should think of heaven, where there is neither cold nor hunger, where the faithful are rewarded with eternal comfort. I do think of it, and I hope it exists, but I cannot quite believe in it. Heaven seems as distant and unlikely as that warm room I imagine, a story told to make endurance possible but not a reality one can truly grasp. What I believe in is stone. Stone is real. Stone is constant. Stone endures long after the flesh that touched it has turned to dust. The castle will outlast me by centuries, and when it finally does crumble, as all things must, it will be because the stone itself has worn away, not because anyone decided it should fall. There is something almost admirable in that permanence, even if it is the permanence of something cold and lifeless. I have lived my life in service to stone, and soon I will be laid beneath stone in the crypt, and stone will be my eternal monument. It is not the legacy I might have wished for, but it is the one I have earned. The castle will stand, and perhaps that is enough. Let me tell you one final thing, the thing that I have learned most clearly in all my years within these walls. Endurance is not the same as living. We endured. We survived winter after winter, year after year. We woke each morning and performed our duties and went to sleep each night, and we called this life. But it was not life as it should be lived. It was existence stripped to its essentials: breath, movement, labour, sleep. The richness that makes life worth living. Joy, love, beauty, purpose. These were luxuries we could not afford. And yet we endured, because human beings are remarkably resilient creatures. We adapt to almost anything, accept almost anything, survive almost anything. This resilience is our strength, but it is also our curse, for it allows us to tolerate conditions that should not be tolerated, to accept suffering that should not be accepted, to call normal what is in fact grotesque. The castle taught me this. It taught me that men can live in cold that should kill them, can eat food that is barely food, can work until their bodies break and then work some more. It taught me that loyalty can outlast love, that duty can outlast hope, that routine can outlast meaning. It taught me that stone is stronger than flesh, that winter is stronger than fire, that power is stronger than mercy. These are hard lessons, and I do not know whether learning them made me wiser or simply harder. I suspect the latter. I'm not the young man who arrived at Carlisle full of vague expectations. That young man is gone, worn away by years of cold, replaced by someone older and colder and emptier. I do not mourn him. Mourning requires energy I no longer have. The candle by which I write grows short. My hand aches from forming these letters, and my eyes strain to see the parchment in the dim light. Outside my window, I hear the wind rising, bringing with it the promise of another storm, another night of cold. The castle settles around me with its familiar groans and creaks, sounds I've heard 10,000 times and will hear a few hundred times more before my path comes to its close. I will finish now. I have said what I wanted to say, perhaps more than I intended. If anyone reads these words, and I doubt anyone will, for who would care about the recollections of an old steward? I hope they will understand what I have tried to convey. Medieval castles were cold and miserable not by accident, but by design. Not temporarily, but constantly, not despite the people who built and maintained them, but in some sense because of them. We built fortresses to protect ourselves from enemies, and in doing so, we imprisoned ourselves in stone. We created symbols of power that required us to sacrifice our comfort, our health, our very humanity. We convinced ourselves that this was necessary, that this was honour, that this was duty. And perhaps it was, but it was also cold, and it was miserable, and it took from us more than it ever gave back. If there is a lesson in this, I suppose it is that strength and endurance are not the same as goodness or wisdom. A castle is strong, but it is not good. It endures, but it does not care. It stands for centuries, but it gives nothing to those who dwell within it except shelter of the coldest and most grudging kind. I've given my life to such a place, and I do not know whether that was foolish or noble or simply inevitable. What I know is that it is nearly over, and I am tired, so very tired, and the cold has finally reached so deep that I do not think warmth will ever touch me again. The castle stands, the wind blows, the stone endures, and I, who have served the stone for 32 years, will soon be laid beneath it, where at last the cold will not matter, because I will not feel it any more. This, then, is my testimony. This is why medieval castles were so cold and miserable. Not because we did not know how to make them better, but because making them better was never the purpose. The purpose was power, and power is always cold. Would you have stayed? Would you have endured? I did. And now it is finished. Written in the year of our Lord 1332, in the 32nd year of my service to Carlisle Castle, by my own hand, whilst I still have strength to hold the quill. May God grant mercy to all who have lived within these walls, and may he grant warmth to those who have known only cold. The stone endures, but we do not.